Hi everybody, I'm Harvey Media and this is Harvey Media Reviews. I don't think that it's any real secret that with rare exceptions, most TV pilots suck. But of course, some suck worse than others. So let's indulge in the TV equivalent of judging a book by its cover, or its first draft, and rank all of the Star Trek pilots from worst to best. Why Star Trek? Well, mainly because I feel like it, and not just because of Leonard Nimoy's recent passing, because even before he passed away, I had started to rediscover exactly what it was that made that series special. And even though I don't personally like it as much as a lot of Trekkies do, I still see how good it is. So, since there are only 6 Star Trek pilots to choose from, instead of doing a worst to best, or best to worst list, I've decided to count down the 3 best and the 3 worst simultaneously, and we'll see what we come up with. Alright, first, the number 3 worst Star Trek pilot ever made, Encounter at Farpoint. Yes, as much as I love Star Trek The Next Generation, even I have to admit, its pilot is abysmal. Obviously not as abysmal as 2 of the other ones, but still pretty damn bad. It feels like the pilot of a show following off of the end of This Island Earth. It's so cheesy, it's so over the top, it's so silly, and it's so stupid. And yet at the same time, there's so many wonderful little bits to watch. Data, Picard, Riker, Worf, all of these characters, despite the fact that they are so silly and so over the top and so laughable, are still good, interesting characters that you want to see. And the bad that this episode reaches is, by all means, a so bad it's good level of bad. So it is a bad episode, but in terms of bad Star Trek pilots, it's number 3 on the list. Speaking of which, number 3 best Star Trek pilot ever made, Where No Man Has Gone Before. It has a decent concept, nice interplay between the characters, but it sacrifices a lot of good sense for action scenes. That is exactly what the network ordered. After the first pilot, The Cage, which we'll talk about later, on which list, who knows. After the first pilot was deemed too cerebral, the studio told them to make a pilot that was more action-focused. So yes, they did make a pilot that was very action-focused, and they got them picked up. And it's not a bad episode by any stretch of the imagination. It's just kind of brainless, to be perfectly honest. The number 2 worst Star Trek pilot, The Caretaker. Star Trek Voyager, the number 2 worst Star Trek show, has the number 2 worst pilot. Why is Star Trek Voyager's pilot the second worst? Because it is, well, stupid and ridiculous and silly. But whereas Encounter at Farpoint was layered with this sort of C-grade sci-fi movie cheese to it, Voyager is played completely straight, completely serious, to a point where it just becomes boring. Not helped by the fact that, remember when I said Encounter at Farpoint was full of all these interesting characters? Voyager is full to the brim of Harry Kims. There's so many characters who have nothing going for them. They have no character whatsoever. And yet these are the characters that the show chooses to focus on, as opposed to all of the interesting characters that do show up in the pilot and are never focused on. For instance, there's the Doctor, a medical hologram, emergency hologram who's activated and is instantly very interesting and gets almost no screen time. And then there's poor Kes, who shows up, is instantly the most interesting character in the room, just is absolutely fascinating to watch, and yet will never be important for the rest of the show. And God bless Kate Mulgrew, who is obviously, even in this pilot, as terribly written as it is obviously a fantastic actress. She is given absolutely nothing to work with in this script, and yet she plays it off as best she can, even though Captain Janeway is one of the most unlikable Starfleet captains that we meet in Star Trek. And all I can say is thank God for Orange is the New Black. If you want to see how good an actress Kate Mulgrew actually is, go watch that show. Because she as Red is amazing. And the number 2 best Star Trek pilot ever made, The Cage. what I mentioned before as being too cerebral. Yeah, it's got an awesome story, awesome concept, fun special effects. It's just a great mindfuck of an episode. The episode plays with your mind and really screws with your perception of reality. I'm often saddened by the fact that Captain Pike wasn't the official captain of Star Trek, because he's really good in this episode. I'm sorry, he just really is. His relationship with Spock isn't much to speak of, so we wouldn't have had that. We probably wouldn't have had that dynamic in the show had it not happened. But then again, Spock isn't really Spock in this episode either. He's still played by Leonard Nimoy, but Leonard Nimoy hasn't quite figured out who Spock is, and I don't think the writers have either. But why isn't it number one? Well, frankly, one of my favorite things about Star Trek, and one of the things that is constantly referred to by people who do love Star Trek, is the relationship with the crew, the camaraderie between the shipmates. And we don't get to see a whole lot of that here. We get to see them working together pretty well, but their personalities are so ill-defined, and the actors are so sort of calm and collected the entire time. We don't really get to see much of that interaction. But still, very solid episode. I greatly enjoy it. And the number one worst Star Trek pilot ever is Broken Bow. Holy crap. We've had stupid pilots. I've already talked about them. But what's worse than being stupid? Being dull. The story goes out of its way to point out how entirely pointless everything you see is. The continuity guffaws are out the wazoo. None of the characters are interesting to watch. Remember when I talked about Voyager and said that, oh, they were really dull except for like a few people who stood out, even if they were annoying at times? No, the only character who stands out is T'Pol, who just highlights the amazingness of Leonard Nimoy's legacy, and how awesome he was for taking a character as dull and bland as Spock could have been and turning him into a very interesting character. Also, showing us how easily we could have all hated Spock for years for being an annoying ass. The reason why I think Encounter at Farpoint is the best of the worst Star Trek pilots, and this is the worst of the worst Star Trek pilots, is because Encounter at Farpoint clearly did not have much of a budget to work with, and it had really stupid-looking special effects. However, even though it failed, it did a lot with them and ended up being a very entertaining ride. Broken Bow obviously had a lot more money and much more impressive special effects, and did nothing with them, instead deciding to sit on their haunches and just let the pretty special effects play out, and hoping that that would be enough. And that is something that I cannot abide. And the number one, all-time, best Star Trek pilot, in my opinion, ever made, Emissary. There are bits of it that do not work. Some of the introductions of the new crew for the show are a bit clunky. At one point, Odo just kind of announces his backstory to someone for no real reason. But really, overall, it's just very well set up. It mixes a solid sci-fi plot with overall strong introductions, including the introduction of the new captain. They introduced that new captain, Benjamin Sisko, as being different from Picard without making him unlikable, as they often did with Picard, as when they were introducing Picard, making him different from Kirk, and has one of the best discussions of nature of humanity found anywhere in Trek. I think the strongest thing about Star Trek, and about science fiction in general, is that it can take huge, cataclysmic, spectacular science fiction events and mix them with a dissection of humanity, so that while our crew, our intrepid crew and our captain, is facing this ultimate alien unknown threat, they must also face their own demons and their own human frailties. Star Trek is an optimistic series about becoming better people. But what Star Trek often forgets is that the only way to become better people is to not ignore what is wrong with us, but to face what is wrong with us, acknowledge it, move past it, and evolve. That is what makes for an optimistic future in my book. Sisko is burdened by an over-attachment to the past, is burdened by his sad memories, and is only by dealing with his dark past and moving beyond it that he's finally able to become the Starfleet human, or maybe even in a small way just to move forward towards that Starfleet ideal of humanity. And through his own evolution as a man, he not only saves himself but the entire universe. And that, my friends, that is what Star Trek is really about. Not about ignoring our faults or saying, it's okay, we're all going to be perfect messiahs someday. Star Trek is about constantly moving forward, not only in space, not only in the realms of the imagination and in the future, but in our hearts, in our minds, and discovering new worlds to boldly go, inside and out. But it's still massively overrated. I'm Harvey Media, and I'll see y'all later.
Why'd you choose Lorna to run for WAC and not me?
You're questioning my decisions.
Only in the most respectful way you could possibly imagine. I thought it was like your Spock.
My what?